Alright students, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you all had a good day, and I hope you're all relatively well-rested, relaxed, safe, and are coming away from the writing workshop without it, melting your brain too much or anything like that. I apologize if that was kind of a boring lecture, but it's important stuff for you to know, and keeping track of all of that stuff will certainly help your grade whenever you do the major writing assignments in this class. But we're moving away from the writing workshop now. And so today we are going to cover the development of Islam. We're going to cover a lot of information today with a lot of names and dates. I will try to be as clear as possible. Additionally, note that these names are coming not only from a language other than English, but one with a different script. This means there are many versions of how these terms are written. You may be more familiar with one or another. All are trying to approximate the complex differences in how we pronounce words. So, let us set the stage in talking about Islam. We are looking at the Arabian Peninsula, which makes up most of the image here, at the open of the 9th century specifically. Before Islam, the Arabian Peninsula consisted primarily of different Christian denominations, namely Byzantine and some Armenian Christians from the north, and even access to Christianity in Ethiopia. Those of the Jewish faith, and above all else, forms of local polytheist faith, of which we sadly know very little today. The region lies to the south of where two empires meet, though neither has much power in the region. Rome, or rather the Eastern Roman Empire, which I will refer to as the Byzantine Empire for most of the course, and the Sassanid Empire, the latest, but not the last, of a series of empires based in Persia. Mecca was a trade center in the region, a meeting place and nexus for trade and movement in a society which was highly nomadic and the low population density this arid environment allowed. Mecca also served as a major center of worship, housing the Kaaba, a cubical shrine that housed the black stones of Mecca. This was the holiest site for the polytheist Arabs, and it is unsurprising that the fixed point of their faith also became politically and economically important. Let's also define a few terms in Arabic which come to have significance in today's lecture. At this time, Arabic is a language spoken only in this small region. Its modern spread into being the language spoken from Morocco to Iraq is a result of the events we will discuss today. Islam, the name given to the new faith about to develop in the region, means submission, understood to mean submitting to God. A Muslim, an adherent of the faith, thus means one who submits. Allah is the Arabic word for God. This means that in portions of the world that speak Arabic, non-Muslims also use the same word to speak of their God. Thus, Allah is not necessarily a term that is expressly exclusive to Islam. It is most commonly used in Islam, but it should not be viewed as an expressly Islamic term. It is an Arabic term, and that is an important distinction to understand. The holy text of Islam is the Quran, which means a recitation. We will return to the meaning of this phrase later in the lecture. Another term we should define is Abrahamic faiths, as well as the term people of the book. Both terms refer to the three faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They are called Abrahamic for their links to the figure Abraham. We've talked briefly about Abraham before, remember in the Binding of Isaac. Well, according to these stories, his son Isaac becomes the ancestor of the Jewish people, and by extension the Christian people, while Abraham's other son Ishmael, who is the son of a different woman, is the progenitor of a group called the Ishmaelites, who are often taken as the ancestors of the Arab people. Christianity, as emerging out of Judaism, is also included in this category. Perhaps more importantly, the term reflects the shared aspects and common stories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the similarities between their core religions. The Muslim term for this is people of the book, emphasizing the shared heritage of the faiths and their texts. Because they recognize this kinship, it impacts how they treat Christians and Jews as opposed to other faiths. Now that we've discussed this, let's move on to the faith itself. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was born in Mecca around 570. In Mecca, he would have been exposed to this multi-faith environment and its mix of ideas. He was born into the Quraysh tribe, the most powerful tribe in Mecca. They are guardians of the Kaaba, as well as being merchants who controlled trade routes to the coasts, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. He was hired by a widow named Khadijah to protect caravans, and they eventually marry. In 610, at the age of 40, Muhammad begins to have visions and hear voices. In one of them, the angel Gabriel appeared to him, telling him to repeat God's words. His recitation is eventually written down as the Quran. These revelations are treated as the next in a series of revelations that have been provided to humanity of the true faith. To Muslims, these revelations are meant to be the final ones before Judgment Day, a final restoration of the true form of the faith that Christianity and Judaism are wayward versions of. In this view, Christ is a prophet, but not the Son of God. Similarly, Muhammad never claims divinity. While their histories are tied, the Quran as the final and true divine revelation acts as a single authored source of religious authority in Islam. Here, it might be a good idea to take a look at the first source in your packet for the day. This is not from the Quran, but a Sunnah, a narrative of the Prophet's life. What is Muhammad concerned about? What is the role of proof in the text, and how does Muhammad use it to establish his authority? So, as you've seen, Muhammad is deeply concerned that people will view him as a liar as we read the source. Remember, Jesus did not exactly survive his own preaching, and indeed, something similar occurs here. Muhammad's preaching upsets Mecca's merchants. Challenging the pagan gods worshipped in Mecca is bad for business, both because it is off-putting to local pagan traders and threatens the protection of those gods. The messages of redistributing wealth also upsets the wealthy clans of Mecca, while, much like Jesus' message, it resonates strongly with the disenfranchised of Mecca, especially the poor and foreigners who were denied rights. At first, Muhammad has supportive relatives, but after their death, the attitude towards Muhammad only continues to sour, and in 622 he flees before someone attempts to assassinate him. This flight becomes known as the Hijra, meaning the emigration or the cutting of ties. This moment marks year 1 of the Muslim calendar. He settles in Yathrib, which is renamed Medina, literally translated as the city of the Prophet or the city after it converts. He builds a community of followers there, which becomes known as the Ummah. From there, Muhammad expands his reach and often through force, funding this expansion by raiding caravans. In 628, he comes in conflict with local Jewish communities, but defeats both them and the Quraysh, his own tribe, in a major victory. His attention then turns northward for a time, but in 630, he returns to Mecca with an army some 10,000 people strong. The city wisely surrenders to this very overwhelming force. While Medina and Jerusalem become holy cities for Islam, Mecca becomes the capital of this growing Islamic power and the unquestioned center of faith for Islam. Muhammad begins by destroying or converting pagan temples in the land. This all means that Islam develops differently from, say, Christianity. Within a generation, Islam is associated with sovereign political power. By contrast, Christianity took hundreds of years to become the main faith of large political players. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about another primary source, so let us take a look at the death of Muhammad. These moments are described in your next primary source, the last days of the Prophet. Muhammad dies in 632, and there are some issues brought about by this death. What kind of concerns are being expressed? Realms and faiths have a real danger of splitting once their founder dies, and Islam, it turns out, will be no exception. His followers are understandably afraid of what will happen to everyone after Muhammad dies, and need to be reconciled for themselves. After all, how do you replace a political and spiritual leader on the level of Muhammad? So, we're going to take a look at the last years of the Prophet. You may want to pause the video now to answer some of the questions I will pose before I answer them. So, first of all, who are the two people that are put forward in the text as being the next heir? I would suggest pausing now to make sure that you can answer that question, and I will repeat it once more. So, first of all, who are the two people that are put forward in the text as being the next heir? Alright, the man who was picked to succeed Muhammad is Abu Bakr. He is Muhammad's father-in-law. However, Ali is Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. Why might he be a desired successor? So, Ali is closer to a familial successor. Although Abu Bakr is senior in Muhammad's family tree, Ali is closer to being Muhammad's son and would ensure that his family ruled Islam. But Abu Bakr is chosen instead. How is this choice made? Okay, so first of all, we see here in the source that Abu Bakr demonstrating leadership by supporting Muhammad's followers and handling grief. He also is portrayed as not pursuing power, offering other names before his own to lead Islam. Ultimately, the decision is made by Muhammad's closest followers. Abu Bakr's choice as Muhammad's successor, however, sets in motion the split between Sunni and Shia, which exists today. Although they develop doctrinal differences over time, who is meant to rule the Dar al-Islam, or the House of Islam, is at the core. Sunnis accept Abu Bakr's election, running off a passage in the Quran that states that the Ummah, that is the community of Islam, will not be wrong in its consensus. The Shia, or the Shah Ali, the partisans of Ali, believe that Ali and other successors in Muhammad's family are the only acceptable successors. So, by the time of Muhammad's death, in 632 CE, the whole of Arabia was under Muslim rule. The stage was now set for the armies of Islam to sweep out of Arabia and overwhelm the remnants of the once great superpowers of Persia and Rome. Yet Muhammad, as we have seen, died without a clear successor for his twin roles as political and spiritual leader of Islam. Over time, this crystallizes into two factions, the Sunni and the Shia. Meanwhile, Islam is expanding. Under Umar, much of Persia, the Levant, and Egypt are conquered. The Byzantines lose control of Jerusalem in 636, signaling the rapid rise of Islamic power. However, Uthman's violent death begins the real conflict between the two groups. Ali, the Shia candidate, is elected next. He becomes the fourth caliph. The term caliph is used to refer to this religious and political leader for Islam. There are four known as the Rashidun, or the four rightly guided caliphs. So, Sunni Muslims reveal all four, but the Shia only recognize Ali specifically as a member of Muhammad's family. Moreover, over time, these two camps have become one of the most fundamental splits in Islam. Sunni Muslims are the majority, but Shia Muslims are predominant in Iran and Iraq. This continues to impact political alliances and conflicts in the Middle East. I should say the modern Middle East. Ali was assassinated in 661, prompting conflict which brings about a new dynasty to rule Islam, the Umayyads. As the Umayyad caliphs are Sunni, future leaders of the Shia are usually known as imams, a term also used for the head of a mosque, reflecting that no heir of Muhammad rules Islam. Now, before we talk briefly about Islamic rule and politics, let's take a brief moment to discuss in depth the beliefs of the faith. So, the Quran is the text composed of Muhammad's revelations. During Muhammad's lifetime, the Quran was an oral text. As he received more revelations, he added verses and reorganized the text. He and his followers then rememorized the revised text. Unlike the first two Abrahamic religions, which were compiled by different people over time, Islam came exclusively from the revelation of God to Muhammad. Once again, this in reference to, once again, the term Islam meaning submitting to God. These revelations are known as the Quran and were ultimately the final sort of divine word of God within the Islamic faith. After the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet, also known as the Hadith, and descriptions of his way of life, the Sunnah, are the most important Muslim texts. There is a clear hierarchy of authority from divine revelation to sayings by the progenitor of the faith to the descriptions of him that provide further insights. So, the two texts we have looked at today come from this class of descriptions of his life, that is the Sunnah. If all else fails, precedent can be a teacher for how to act in the future. So, compared to Judaism and Christianity, Islam emphasizes practice, including observing the 5 pillars of Islam. They are Shahada, the profession of faith, namely that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, one of the most oft-repeated phrases within the Islamic world. Then there is Salat, or prayer 5 times a day, and collective prayers on Friday. Zakat, or almsgiving, that is, giving charity to the poor, harkens back to Muhammad's original message of the redistribution of wealth. The Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once during a person's life, if they are able. The Hajj is still taken by many to this day. Sawm, or observing Ramadan. This is a period of the 9th month of the year commemorating when the Quran was first revealed to Muhammad. Now, we should also include something about the term jihad. This is a word that is often thrown about imprecisely, as people often equate it to the term crusade in Christianity. However, this is not really an accurate comparison. The proselytization and expansion of the faith is in fact the quote-unquote lesser jihad, while the personal struggle to improve oneself is the greater jihad. The effort to improve oneself in the community of the faithful is the purpose of this term, to which the expansion of the ranks of the faithful is not the only or even necessarily the best way to achieve this. So that's just an important distinction between the two different types of jihad, and hopefully to clarify the misunderstanding of the term jihad equating to essentially the equivalent to the European term crusade. So, we should also address the role of the Kaaba, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. The Kaaba, which was brought up much earlier, remained as central to Muslim religious life as it was to the pre-Islamic faiths. As a sanctuary and a site of worship, it was seen as an important part of Mecca's role as a religious and cultural center, as well as being a focal point of worship for travelers. Following Muhammad's 630th conquest of Mecca, the Kaaba was stripped of its idols and they were destroyed, much as many holy sites in Europe were Christianized after conversion. This was treated as a restoration of the site, as the young faith believed that the Kaaba was initially constructed by Abraham and Ishmael, returning to the idea of Islam as a restoration of lapsed faith. Yet the site did not lose its important cultural function and is the endpoint of the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca, as the quote-unquote house of God, and now rests within the Grand Mosque of Mecca. Now, back to wrap up our lesson in Islam's history, Ali was assassinated in 661 and a civil war broke out. A new dynasty emerged from the civil war known as the Umayyad Caliphate, with its capital in Damascus in modern-day Syria. None of the Umayyads had ever been close companions of Muhammad. When the Umayyad armies reached the Maghreb, or northwest Africa, they were met with stiff resistance. After extensive fighting, the Umayyad army attacked Carthage again in 698 and captured the city, which was at that time held by the Byzantines. Likewise, they finally defeated the Berber armies under the leadership of the Queen Kahina in 702. In the east, Umayyad armies were pushed back and failed to capture Constantinople, or the capital of the Byzantine Empire, in 717. And the Byzantines from this point generally managed to hold on to Anatolia, or what is modern-day Turkey, for the next couple centuries. Following their conquest of North Africa, the Umayyads crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered Spain, which had been under the control of the Visigoths. After a century of rapid expansion, their forward momentum was halted in 732 CE, when the Franks defeated the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours, something we'll talk about again on our Carolingian Day. For several centuries, the southern half or so of Spain will be firmly in Muslim hands. In 750, a revolt topples the Umayyads. While a branch of the family survives for some time in Iberia, or what is modern-day Spain and Portugal, and we'll come back to that region later in the semester, they lose control of most of Muslim-controlled lands. Islam's fracturing is political now, as well as religious. No longer does one power rule all of the Islamic lands. Islam as a faith will never again be so united as it was under both the Rashidun Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate. So, moving forward to the next great dynasty in this period, descended from Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the new house, which takes control under Abdul Abbas as-Safra, is referred to as the Abbasids. Here you can see the process of the spread of Islam. So, you can see here that in the 9th century, several other Muslim states exist. Somewhat independent, they owe at least nominal allegiance to Baghdad, with limited expectations of monetary or military support, or another term for this would be suzerainty. In 762, Al-Mansur, looking to establish a new capital to distinguish his dynasty from the Umayyads, establishes Baghdad as the capital of the Abbasid Empire, moving away from Damascus, which had previously been the Umayyad capital. The site is north of the Ctesiphon, the capital of the now defunct Sassanids, and now abandoned Babylon. Baghdad becomes a political center of Islam for centuries, and is a center of cultural ferment, not just for Islam, but is one of the centers of scientific and cultural development worldwide. As the Abbasids establish more stable rule in the 9th century and begin to benefit from the wealthy land they now controlled, this begins a period of cultural flowering, with construction and learning benefiting greatly. In Baghdad, they established the House of Wisdom, a center for academic thought for centuries. Madrasas were also established as schools across the Abbasid domain, improving learning long before universities were began in Europe. The House of Wisdom, and to an extent the madrasas, preserved texts lost or neglected in Europe, including many Greek thinkers. In fact, Europe's first exposure to those writers would not come by reading the original ancient Greek, but by reading translations from the Arabic versions of texts. One of the most notable figures from this period was Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna by Western readers who read his works translated into Latin. He was a philosopher and an astronomer. Perhaps more importantly, he also is often called the father of early modern medicine. By age 21, he wrote a medical textbook that would be used for centuries thereafter. In fact, he was so forward-thinking that if you were to look in his medical textbook, he actually produced one of the earliest, in fact, possibly the earliest, I guess you could say, elements of what would become our modern-day germ theory. Just a little fun fact for you. So, and as you can see in this image on the left, there is an image of an eye in a manuscript of Ibn Sina's work. It contains an impressive degree of accurate observations about the structure of the eye, showing the level of sophisticated knowledge of the human anatomy available as early as the 11th century. So, you can also see the interior of a madrasa. I don't know about you, but I would love to have had a class in a space such as this, between its both large, spacious architecture and its incredibly decorated work. Now, to end today's lecture, let's discuss how Muslims dealt with those of other faiths. While many of these regions are today predominantly Muslim, they still contain sizable minorities of Christians and Jews. Conversion was a centuries-long process that was never fully completed. Over this process, Muslim rulers had to find ways to live with subject communities of other faiths. The accommodations they made are collectively known as the Pax of Umar, or Umar, Again, this is an instance of potentially confusing transliteration from Arabic to Latin script. As you read this, you will see there are restrictions in those rights of other faiths. And of course, there were always roles in government non-Muslims would find largely inaccessible. They further were often expected to pay an extra tax, the jizya, reflecting an effort to create incentives to convert rather than to force it at sword point. Remember also the status of Christians and Jews as quote-unquote people of the book. They are not Muslims, but they do accept, in Muslim eyes, at least part of the truth, and so should be encouraged to adopt Islam rather than painfully separated from their current faith. So, for now, we're going to be moving away from Islam and for a time, and returning to what is occurring over in Western Europe. The next lecture focuses on the Carolingians and introduces Charlemagne, a pivotal figure in Europe's history, or at least in its historical imagination. Remember that your next source analysis is due Sunday this week, exploring the sources we have on Charlemagne's coronation.